Good. So let's talk a little bit about what burnout is and also what it isn't. So, as I said before, burnout isn't just feeling stressed at work. It is so much more than that. And I know this because I've been there myself. And it took me just 6 short months to go from being fully functional at work and never experienced a mental health problem in my entire life to being so completely broken and removed from who I had been before that I didn't recognize myself anymore. And at the point when I realized that I was in over my head, I pretty much ticked every single box of a mental health crisis, bar any thoughts of suicide. But my thinking was very disordered, and I suspect I was probably quite close to that point. Now, I knew as things were getting worse at work and how, with the stress piling up, I knew that there was something wrong as I declined into this crisis, but I couldn't put my finger on what was happening, let alone take any action to help myself. There was so much blame. I blamed myself entirely. And there was a lot of denial that was happening as well, that was perpetuated by both internal shame and guilt that I was experiencing. And there was a lot of external pressure put on me to perform and to not show any outward sign of struggle. And I just adopted the classic medic coping strategy of working more, working harder, spending more time at work, dedicating myself to my patients, and blaming myself. Worse, I was completely clueless about how workplace stress can affect you and cause these sorts of symptoms. I had no idea that what I was experiencing had a name. I didn't know what burnout was at that particular point in time. It had never been mentioned in my medical school training or postgraduate training. And if a doctor with years of clinical knowledge and experience and a background in neuroscience didn't get it, then how can we expect other people to know, such as yourselves? So I'm very lucky. I have been supported to get better by NHS practitioner health. I've had a GP look after me, a therapist look after me. This all happened 6 years ago now, and I am well into my recovery journey. And I say that I'm pretty much back to baseline function now. But as I recovered, I realized that there was so much more to a successful recovery than simply, medical and psychological support. So burnout recovery forces you to look deeply at the root cause of your burnout, which is the workplace. And you need to make effective changes to how you work in order to successfully recover and continue to go to work. And there is a huge gap in knowledge about exactly what this means, which is why I have put together the course for you. So let's talk about the definition of burnout, because burnout really, a lot of people don't understand what it is, and they use the term stress and burnout interchangeably. So hopefully I'm going to tell you a little bit about the definition and how it's differentiated from regular stress. So burnout was first described back in the 1970s by a psychologist who observed the mental and emotional distress of healthcare workers that were working in a free AIDS and HIV clinic in New York. And you can well imagine at that particular point in time, in that particular point in history, and in that location, that that was a very stressful job to be doing. And they realized that what they were seeing in these healthcare workers was different to previously defined stress-related problems. However, it wasn't until 2019 that it was officially recognized and given a definition by the World Health Organization. And they describe burnout as this. This is their official definition. So it's an occupational syndrome that arises as the result of prolonged workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And there are three core features of burnout, and you have to have all three of these features in order to meet the definition. So the first one is depersonalization, which is basically the apathy, the cynicism, the not caring that comes with full-blown burnout. The second is emotional exhaustion. So this is the very real physical and emotional fatigue that you get when you've cared for too much for too long. And I imagine that everyone here can identify with this particular point of burnout. We all go through periods of emotional exhaustion when we are stressed, but not everyone who is emotionally exhausted goes on to develop burnout. And finally, reduce performance at work in whatever form that takes for you. Now, without these three components, technically, you don't have burnout, but it is incredibly common to identify with one or two of these components if you are at risk of burnout, if you're in the early stages of sliding into burnout, if you work a stressful job. Now, as I said, the component that most people identify with is emotional exhaustion. But emotional exhaustion and depersonalization, those two are considered to be the core components of burnout, really. Now, as I said, as burnout has become a topic that more people are aware of, I see the term burnout being used a lot to describe work stress and exhaustion without the understanding that you need all three of those components in order to officially have burnout. So, what I would say is if you can get over your work fatigue and exhaustion with a holiday or some time away from work, then you most likely don't have burnout syndrome. Burnout syndrome starts off as being reactive to your work, yes, but eventually it just pervades every aspect of your life. However, what I would say is that if you think that you are at risk of burnout, then and you're not there yet, this is a great opportunity to take action and to act to stop things from progressing and getting to that 1 to 3 year recovery period. Now, there are also just a couple of things about the definition that I want to touch on. So, it's not officially considered to be a mental health problem, it's considered to be an occupational syndrome. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this is the case. The person that helped to define it, the matriarch at Burnout Research, was very clear that she wanted employers and organizations to realize that they are responsible for creating cultures that are anti-burnout, and she didn't want individuals to take the blame of burnout, right? She feels it's very much a workplace problem. However, it is therefore it's not recognized as a medical problem, and it's also because it is considered to be kind of the normal endpoint of stress. So it's it's basically when you experience stress, it's on a spectrum. It's completely normal to experience stress and to have a stress response, but basically when you end up with the stress being chronic, prolonged, intense, that's when it kind of tips over into pathology. But this is a normal response. Burnout is the body's normal response to prolonged stress, right? So it's not considered to be like a pathology in the same way that a depression or anxiety is, for instance. So about 60% of people have a mental health problem such as anxiety or depression alongside burnout, but 40% don't. So no, nearly half of people, it's a standalone problem. And when you make changes to how you work and how you manage your stress, then you will recover. All right. The definition also doesn't recognize burnout as occurring outside of the workplace. This is outside the scope of the talk, but I 100% disagree with this because any situation where there's chronic stress, you can develop burnout. And I'm thinking particularly about parental burnout and caregiver burnout, which are groups that are excluded from this definition. Also, people that are neurodivergent are excluded from this definition, but they are at high risk of burnout and normally rapid cycles of burnout as well. And for those people, it's it's the ADHD or the autism that is fueling the burnout. Workplace stress forms a component of that, but mostly it's about being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. And so, yes, you might need to think about how you're managing your workplace stress, but it's not the main cause of your burnout. Okay. And as we well know, for all of us that are here, burnout in the NHS is a huge problem. So, first of all, it's often not recognised until it's too late. The pressures of working in the current economic climate and within the NHS are huge. You know, the surgery that I was working in, I was expected to see up to 50 patients a day. We were basically on call for every day that we were in. There was never a let up, there was never a respite, and it was just yeah, it was just too much. And there is still, we're talking about it more, but there is still a big gap in knowledge about burnout and the support that's available. But luckily, I'm here to help you guys today with that. Okay, so let's talk about the 5 stages of burnout. So these are the 5 stages that have been identified in the burnout literature as the 5 common stages that people that are sliding into burnout go through. And it starts off at one end with, feeling great, feeling really optimistic, enthused by your work, and ending up in burnout with, a whole myriad of physical symptoms, emotional symptoms, mental symptoms. And what's really good about this 5 stages is, as I'm going through, what I just like you to do is to think about where you might sit. And if you sit in any of the first 3 stages, then you're not in burnout yet. This is a great opportunity to make changes. And what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is tell you exactly what you need to do next, depending on where you sit in the 5 stages of burnout. So the first stage of burnout is the honeymoon phase, which is a pretty self-explanatory phase, right? It's characterized by enthusiasm for your work. It's typically relevant to when you take on new jobs or new roles, new tasks or initiatives. At this stage, no signs of burnout. You feel creative, optimistic, full of energy, and you're very productive. You take on every possible task. You take every opportunity to perform your best, which sounds great. But the trouble with this stage is that if you don't adopt strategies to wind down and ensure that you're not taking on too much, then you can progress to the second stage before you realize it. Now, the second stage is the onset of stress, and this is when some days are more stressful than others. And there are three things that particularly characterize this stage. So the first one is lack of time for personal needs. The second is seeing your friends and family less. And the third is your job taking priority over everything else in your life. Now, in this particular stage, you might start to notice the onset of physical symptoms. And burnout is a hugely physical thing to experience. So the sorts of things you might start to notice in this stage might be things like headaches, shortness of breath, chest pains, palpitations, stomach aches. And interestingly, the most commonly reported physical symptom of burnout is muscular tension and pain. By the way, this is not a comprehensive list, but those are just some of the things you might start noticing when you start to get stressed. In this stage, you might also start to notice some mild emotional or psychological symptoms, including difficulty focusing and concentrating. If your stress continues to be a problem, then you might then move to the third stage. So the third stage is chronic stress, and this is when your stress levels become frequent and constant, and you're having more difficult days than you're having good days, if that makes sense. And in this particular stage, your problem-solving skills and your performance really start to drop off. You start feeling like you're out of control, that you're powerless. Your productivity decreases. A lot of people find themselves procrastinating in this stage as they get really overwhelmed with everything that it is that they need to do at work. You might start to feel like you're not performing well at your job, and with this comes a huge sense of guilt and failure. And actually, the sense of guilt that is experienced in guilt in burnout, sorry, is so pervasive that some researchers actually argue, sorry, that that it should form part of the official definition. At the moment, it's not there, but that's how important and how universal that experience is. Now, in terms of your symptoms, in this particular stage, because your stress hormones are chronically activated, you know, your adrenaline, your cortisol, that suppresses your immune system. So you might find yourself getting ill more frequently with minor illnesses, for instance. One of the hallmarks of burnout is this thing called emotional dysregulation, and this tends to start in this particular stage. So you might find like you're not able to emotionally regulate yourself in the same way that you used to prior to feeling stressed. So even small things that you previously would have handled with calm, with ease, with grace, might make you aggressive, resentful, sad. Things that you could previously calmly manage might send you flying off the handle. You might burst into tears over things that previously wouldn't have bothered you. That's emotional dysregulation. That's a core symptom of burnout. Now, in this stage as well, people start to socially withdraw. So you might distance yourself from your colleagues and your social life, but the denial is very strong in this particular stage. So even though you might be experiencing quite significant symptoms at this point, the chances are that you haven't realized what's happening to you. This is also a hallmark feature of burnout. It's part of the process. Unfortunately, that denial is just part of the experience. So it's not your fault if you're there and you haven't realized it yet. Now, in extreme cases, because obviously your symptoms are significant by this point, some people start turning to um, alcohol, drugs, other substances to try to manage their symptoms in this particular stage. Now, the next stage of burnout is burnout itself. And this is when you reach critical exhaustion levels that make it difficult to cope with work demands. So, in this stage, the continuous sense of failure and powerlessness leads to the feeling of despair and disillusionment, and you can't see a way out. You become indifferent to your work. And this is where you develop that hallmark feature. Do you remember the definition where I said depersonalization was one of the core symptoms? This is when you develop it in this particular stage of burnout, and apathy really is the key emotion in this particular stage. So in this particular stage, all of the symptoms that you've had before, so all of the emotional, psychological, physical symptoms, they will be very, very strong by this particular point. In particular, the physical symptom that most people identify with in this stage is disproportionate fatigue. So overwhelming fatigue that is in no way proportional to the amount of sleep that you're getting. By the way, you're probably not sleeping at all by this point because insomnia is a very common symptom. But it doesn't matter how much sleep you're getting, you're going to feel absolutely physically drained. Um, And alongside this, obviously, develop sense of self-doubt and pessimism in this particular stage of burnout too. And then the final stage of burnout is habitual burnout. And this is when you are unable to recover from burnout and it has become habitualized. So any attempt to bring yourself back to normal in this stage is not successful. And you'll find that it will be really significantly affecting every aspect of your life, your career, your home life, etc. Now, this particular stage of burnout, as I said before, not everyone who experiences burnout has a mental health problem alongside it. But if you do have a mental health problem, in this particular stage, it's characterized by depression. So, at this particular point in life, you're very likely to have lost your joy for life, likely to be feeling incredibly unmotivated, feeling sad, feeling low. And at this particular point, you are going to need external help to recover. So, you're going to need to speak to a GP, a therapist, for instance. The need for expert help is the thing that really defines this particular stage of burnout. So, let's just take a moment to reflect and think about where you might sit in these stages of burnout at this particular point in time. Now, here's what you need to do next. Hopefully, you've identified the stage of burnout that you're currently sitting in. If your stage is 1 to 3, then you are at risk of burnout. You're stressed, but you're not there yet. This is actually, it doesn't feel like it's a good thing. However, it's a really great opportunity for you to take proactive steps to prevent yourself from progressing to full-blown burnout. If you're watching this and you think, actually, I think that I'm in stages 4 or 5, well, ideally, what you need to do is to stop, take a break from work, and seek expert help, whether that's from your GP, occupational health department. I've said EAP there, but practitioner health, the professional support unit, whatever it is that's available to you, depending on your job title and stage of training. There are things out there that and organisations and things available to help you. If you identify with any features of mental health crisis, and in particular, any thoughts of self-harm or suicide, please pick up the phone and speak to your GP urgently or call 111. All right. So let's move now to think about burnout recovery. Now, this is aimed primarily at those of you that identify as being burnt out or post-burnout. However, even if you're in the earlier stages, stages 1 to 3, this is still very relevant because a lot of the evidence around effective burnout recovery is also the evidence around burnout prevention. So this is still going to be 100% important for you too. Now, the stages of burnout recovery came from a study that was done a long time ago now. But what they did is it was an observational study where they looked at people that were hugely burnt out and they followed them on their burnout journeys. And what they found was that everyone's journey looked unique. However, there were 6 stages that every single person went through on their recovery process. And, when I was going through my own recovery process, I got frustrated by a number of things. The first one was the length of time it was taking to get better. I honestly thought I was going to smash my recovery out of the park, right? I was such a high achieving medic. I've sailed through all of my exams. I've achieved very high academically. I was that really annoying person at medical school that, was super keen and did really well in their exams. And I absolutely thought that I was going to smash my recovery out of the park. And that prolonged period and non-linear nature of the recovery process was so frustrating. I was so upset with myself. I was like, what am I doing wrong? I should be getting better and I'm not. But that's because it takes time. And there are things that you need to do in every stage of recovery to help you to progress to the next stage. And there were things that I was missing out that I didn't realize at that particular point in time. So what I'm going to tell you now with this presentation is just a brief overview of all of these stages of recovery, what you need to focus on in order to get better. And then in the course, there's lots of exercises that you can do to help identify where you're at and exactly what you need to do next to help you to recover to the next stage. Okay. So the first 2 stages of burnout recovery are crisis and distancing from work. And these 2 things normally happen either at the same time or in rapid succession. So first one is physical and emotional collapse, that crisis point when you realize that you're in over your head and you have to do something about what's happening to you. And for myself, it was having a panic attack. I'd never had a panic attack before, and it was over something that was nothing really. And that was a moment when I suddenly thought, I'm in over my head and I have to do something about this. I can't control this. It's controlling me now. So, it's surprisingly hard to recognize burnout in yourself, like with many problems. And the first thing you have to do is to recognize it yourself. And at the point that you realize that you're in a crisis, it'll be very obvious to the people around you, but it might not have clicked for you just yet. In this particular stage, you are very likely to need to reach out for expert help from a doctor or a therapist. This is, it might be difficult for some depending on how easy it is to access those services. The next stage of burnout recovery is distancing from work. Now, in this stage, it is recommended that you have a physical and a psychological break from work. Now, most people do this by taking sick leave, but some not necessarily. Some people quit their jobs in order to kickstart their burnout recovery. Now, sick leave and leaving their jobs is not accessible to everyone, particularly in the current economic circumstances. Things are difficult with the job market. We have a cost of living crisis. It's not always available to people. Sick leave, if you're on a substantive contract, then of course that's available to you. But the problem with medics is we don't give ourselves permission to take sick leave. So please take this as your permission to take the leave that you need if you identify with being in burnout right now. However, that said, the majority of people don't take sick leave, but you do have to put changes in place at work to help distance yourself from the things that are causing you to be stressed out. So you can get that distance through doing those things, but it is really hard to do that. Now, the people that take sick leave, on average, take 3.5 months. Some people it's less, some people it's up to a year. So the period of it's not going to be a case of a 2 week sick note from your GP and that's it, happy days, you're back to work and everything's fine. No, you are likely to need a considerable amount of time off work. Now, don't panic if you haven't taken sick leave or if it's not available to you. I didn't take sick leave and I've still been able to recover. Um, it's not ideal from a recovery perspective, but most people do continue to work through their recovery and they do get better regardless of whether or not they take sick leave. So be reassured by that. The third stage of burnout recovery is restoration of health. And in this stage of recovery, initially, most people sleep excessively. So do you remember I went going back to the fourth stage of burnout, which and I mentioned that fatigue and disproportional fatigue is the main physical symptom of that particular stage. So this is where your body is trying to correct that fatigue deficit, right? So most people in this stage, they either sleep longer overnight or they take frequent naps during the day. And besides sleep, in this particular stage, because you are so physically tapped out, it's important that you only engage in low energy activities that are not outcome driven, right? So this is your permission to stay in bed, to doom scroll, to play a game on your phone, to watch Netflix. This is what you need to be doing in this particular stage of recovery. Um, and then after the initial fatigue starts to improve, then you can start thinking about doing things that require a little bit more energy, ensuring that you're pacing yourself, because what you'll find is if you do too much too early, that you'll just end up going back to bed the day after. So you really need to respect the fact that you're going to struggle with your energy levels. Um, but in terms of what the evidence says that you need to prioritize in this stage, it's socializing and starting to do your hobbies and then doing a little bit of physical exercise. And the thing that really makes a difference in this stage is socializing. You don't have to go and tell your colleagues, your friends about your burnout. It's just about building those connections and getting that emotional support. That's the thing that really makes a difference. The fourth stage of burnout recovery is revision of values. So, having at this point, having gained a little bit more energy, people start to think about their old values and take efforts to replace them with new values. And they question what they think was important and find meaning in their new values. So basically, in burnout, pretty much everyone that goes through it values their health more after they've gone through that process. And you have to, right? Because if you don't respect what you've been through and you continue to make decisions about your career and your life based on what used to be important to you, then you're going to make bad decisions for your recovery. So most people, the majority, pretty much 100% of people value their health and then make decisions about their future life and career based off of those new values. I missed this stage out when I went through burnout, and I didn't realize how important it was until I started to slide again. And I went back and I did work on this and realized, okay, the decisions I'm making about my career right now, they used to serve me, they're not serving me anymore. So don't skip this step. Um, so, I mean, it's the same as, any major life event, like getting married, having a bereavement, getting divorced, having children. Those things change what's important to you, and burnout is exactly the same as that. The fifth stage of burnout recovery is exploring work options. This is basically window shopping for what you need to do at work in order to recover and stay recovered. So it's really important that you find opportunities that respect your burnout and that are in alignment with your new values. You've already done this work, remember, so you know what it is that you want out of your career. Um, but it's window shopping. And in this stage, people explore a lot of options without the fear or the burden of having to commit to anything. And this is the point where you can really start to think about the long term for yourself and what it is that you need to do at work to stay recovered. And then the final stage of burnout recovery is making those changes. And I think that this is the hardest stage to do well. Um, so, in terms of the changes that you might make changes at the job that you're in at the moment. You might leave your job. You might step into a similar role in a different, with a different employer, for instance, or, you could go and explore something completely different. Some people leave the jobs that burnt them out, but some people don't. And what you decide to do next will very much depend on the reasons why you burnt out, um, and whether or not the changes that you need to make are ones that you can sustain. And there are six workplace factors that cause burnout. This is all detailed in the course. And what I suggest that you do is go and have a look at those workplace factors and identify them, and then think about how you can make changes in order to reduce the impact of those work factors on your experience of work and your stress levels. You have to be really realistic about what you can achieve as well, because within the NHS, it's very tricky to be able to make those changes, and particularly when you're already in a vulnerable position, as you are when you have gone through burnout. So let's talk a little bit about your recovery essentials and the three key predictors of a successful burnout recovery. Now, I said before, there is this idea, maybe myth, that you need to leave your job and make dramatic changes in order to recover. And actually, the reassuring thing, I think, about the literature is that this isn't necessarily the case. Now, for some people, it is the right thing to do. And I know of one GP who quit their job and then went to work as a park ranger for 6 months in the wilderness. And that's what they needed to do to deal with their burnout, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way for yourself. Um, let's just briefly talk about some of those myths, because that's one of the main ones. The other one is about length of recovery. I think because as medics, we're very type A people and we're used to being able to troubleshoot and problem shoot and fix our patients and all this sort of stuff. I think there is that expectation that we can do the same to ourselves when it comes to burnout. And let's not forget that, when it comes to burnout recovery, that there are multiple layers of complexity around our own internal sense of guilt, but also the weaponized and the external guilt that is placed on us as well. Average length of recovery is 1 to 3 years, and that is what the data says. You can't escape it. Now, thinking back to if we just go back to the stages of burnout recovery, the majority of these stages happen within the first few weeks and months of realizing that you're burnt out. It's this bit here, making a change, where the majority of that 1 to 3 year recovery period will be. So the thing to remember here is that you're going to be making those changes at work before you are fully recovered. This is completely normal, but it also means that you really need to respect your burnout and the fact that you will have reduced capacity for stress and work at that particular point in time. Over time, it will get better, but you do just need to make sure that you're respecting that in those early days. As I said, average amount of time off work is 3.5 months. Not essential, most people work through it, but helpful if you can take it. The 6 stages of recovery are not likely to be linear. That's the other thing that's important to remember. And you don't just need medical and psychological support, you need to make changes at work, and this is where the course comes in. Now, these are the things that the scientific literature says make the difference when it comes to burnout recovery. It's not leaving the job that burnt you out, it's not taking sick leave. These are things that are accessible to every single one of you that are sat here right now. The first one is believing that you are in control of your work. Note the phrasing, not actually having control at work. Let's face it, we work for the NHS, and there are so many things about working in the NHS that we cannot control, such as the number of patients that are coming in, the complexity of those patients, the lack of resource, the lack of service, rota gaps, all of that stuff you cannot control. You can do nothing about it, but there will be some small things that you can control that are within your sphere of influence. But even if those things are not the things that you want, or are not ideal for yourself, just knowing that you have that control and believing it is enough to help you to recover successfully. And the reason why this makes a difference is because the people that genuinely believe this are more likely to make effective changes at work, behavioral changes that then help with their recovery. The second thing is supportive relationships. So, a community that gets you, that supports you, is really fundamental to a successful recovery. It's also one of the things that if you don't have can cause burnout. So it's if you're thinking about if you're feeling stressed, if you're in stages 1 to 3, getting a peer support network that really gets you and the job that you're doing is really fundamental to preventing that progression into full-blown burnout. And then the final thing is believing that you are in control of your own well-being. And most people get this belief through therapy-based techniques, and therapy really is a game changer for burnout. The types of therapy that are evidence-based are CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, and my personal favorite, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. Sorry, it just literally just fell out of my head just then. But those two things are great. And actually, what's really fantastic about acceptance and commitment therapy is that that values piece, like working out your values, is part of that particular type of therapy. So it's a really fantastic thing to go through, basically. If you are in burnout right now, I think everyone should have some sort of therapy. So those are the things that predict a successful recovery. And if there's nothing else that you concentrate on during that recovery period, it's these three things. I mention this a lot in the course. I say it a lot because people need to hear this, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the mistakes that I made. I've already touched on some of the expectations and how, generally speaking, we feel like things should get better quicker than they actually do. And I talk about my mistakes and my recovery milestones so you can get an idea about what an actual, I've been there, I've done that, I know what it is to experience. So you've got a good idea of it. As I've already said, expectations are that you're going to recover with 2 weeks of sick leave and no changes made at work, and that's just not going to cut the mustard, unfortunately. When you're making changes at work, regardless of what it is that you decide to do, and by the way, the course will take you through a whole list of exercises that will help you to identify the things that caused you to burn out and what you need to prioritize, given your restricted energy levels right now, in order to return to work well, is that you mustn't do too much too soon. And you have to make sure that you are ready to move to the next stage at every point in that recovery journey. You can't rush it. There's no point if you're sleeping huge amounts of time and napping during the day. There is absolutely no point of you expending that valuable energy that you have on thinking about what you're going to do, like, the changes that you're going to make at work. At that point, you should just be focusing on your physical health, right? So don't rush yourself. And you must respect your burnout when you're making changes in the early stages. And also, you don't need to make drastic changes, which I think is very reassuring. So let's just talk about some of the milestones that I experienced on my recovery journey. Um, it's long, it's tough, it's frustrating. But reaching recovery milestones is a really great way of, it's a great opportunity just to reflect and to think about how far you've come. Now, some of my milestones were about big changes that happened in my behavior, such as improving my self-neglect habits and the things that I'd kind of stopped doing. I stopped looking after myself. Others were incredibly personal and meaningful. The majority were simply breakthroughs in how I felt. And they were considered to be significant to me on a personal level. When you get to those stages, you'll just know that things have changed, that things have shifted, and that things are moving forward. And it's really, really lovely when you get there. So the first milestone that I experienced was having the energy to look after myself. So even though I had really significant symptoms when I burnt out, I was still turning up to work and going through the motions. Um, Struggling, yes, and really struggling with decision fatigue, but still able to deliver safe enough patient care. I know this because the partners told me that they were happy with my performance. However, outside of work, I was a mess. I was not looking after myself. I was not eating properly. I'd stopped exercising. Some days I didn't brush my teeth, wash my face. I was really not looking after myself properly. Um, and for me, prioritizing those very basic self-care things, such as showering, washing my face, brushing my teeth, that was a big milestone for me. Um, it was, to be truthful, I only did this because my husband made made me. But having the energy to be able to do those things was a huge recovery milestone for me. Crucial first step to dragging myself out of the dark hole that I'd ended up in. The second milestone in my recovery was because I was also clinically depressed when I burnt out. And I felt very, very low for many weeks, and didn't really experience any joy. I was so flat and unmotivated. I was out with my children, and it was I don't even remember what we were doing. It was mundane, insignificant. But I suddenly realized that I was enjoying myself. And even now, like thinking about it, like listening to it, like I'm really emotional just thinking about it because I feel like that burnout period robbed me of such joy and spending time with my children. And that still makes me really sad, as you can tell. But that moment, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm enjoying this. And it felt so novel because I'd been so depressed for so long. And I had completely forgotten what it felt like to feel happy. I know that sounds ridiculous, but all of a sudden I was like, oh my goodness, this is how I should be feeling. And yeah, it was a huge milestone for me. And if you're there, if you're in that depression phase, trust me, you can experience this as well. You will start to feel better. My third milestone was realization that I was experiencing more good days than difficult days. The thing about burnout is pretty much every day is awful. Every day is a struggle. Every day you're having to put so much effort into just turning up and being present, right? But you will notice when things start to get a little bit easier. And when you realize there are more good days than bad, then that is a very good step for you. Going back to NHS work, I had a little bit of, when I was under NHS practitioner health, I had a little bit of time off of NHS work. I did continue to do private work because that work wasn't as stressful in the same way that NHS work. But going back and being able to manage my work stress was a huge milestone. And actually, the first shift that I did back was a locum shift in urgent care on a bank holiday weekend, which was probably not, in retrospect, was not a good choice. But I got there and I looked at the list of patients and I was like, oh my, how are we going to manage this? This is not safe. I had a moment where my heart was racing in my chest and I just felt so overwhelmed. I was like, how am I going to cope with this? Took myself off for 5 minutes, had a cup of tea, practiced my therapy techniques, calmed myself down, went back and did the job. And that for me there was the sign that I could still do the job and I could do it well. Shift was fine, by the way. It's all in my head. Then the next milestone was having the energy, concentration, and focus to be proactive about my well-being needs, um, and, and particularly asking for help. I had got into this headspace that I couldn't ask for help with anything, childcare, cleaning, help at work, whatever it was. And then I suddenly realized actually I can ask for help. And I basically started to look after myself properly. So I joined a gym. I started going to gym classes. I scheduled all of the dental, optician, medical appointments that I'd been putting off. My optician was sending me letters saying, we're no longer supplying, contact lenses to you because it's been so long since you've come for your eye checkup. And I had zero motivation up until that point to actually book anything. So those things, also reading a book for the first time after burnout, I just didn't have the energy or the concentration to do that. That was a big milestone. Then the next thing was I was very lucky that I could locum and do NHS work during this particular time, but I found that doing the shifts left me with considerable fatigue. So I'd go and do a 4 hour out of hours shift, come home, the next day I'd be on the sofa. I couldn't move. I was so exhausted. But with time, I didn't need that prolonged recovery period. And I realized I was incredibly privileged to be able to work like that. And it was really important actually for me to be able to recover, to have that opportunity to do the shorter shifts. And a big milestone was when I realized that I could work a full day, a full shift, and not need a recovery period. That was very big for me. And then the next thing for me was my problem solving skills and my confidence came back. And when that happened and it just clicked into place, I was like, I feel like myself again. And my husband was saying to me, he's like, I've got my wife back again. And that was incredible. So that's just my recovery journey in a nutshell. The things that kind of, you can see the stepwise progression there of me getting better. And the same thing will happen to you. You will experience similar milestones when you realize that things are starting to get better. And the course is going to help you to achieve that. Okay, so talking about the course, let me show you exactly how it works. So I'm just going to stop sharing that screen. Apologies for the technical difficulties. And then what I'm going to do is share the landing page. Let me just do that. I can see that there is a little bit of chat, so I will answer your questions shortly. So when we finish the webinar, you will be sent the link to sign up to the recovery course. And this is the landing page. A little bit of copy here about what it involves and some of the terms and conditions. What you just need to do is enter your name, enter your email, check the, tick the box here and click. And then when you do that, you will get into the course. Now, I'm hoping that this is sharing the right screen at the minute. So this is what the preview looks like, just so you've got an idea about how it's structured. This is the landing page, and then what you'll see down on the right-hand side here is the structure of the course. Now, what I've done is I've structured it so that it can be done sequentially, and it takes a logical route through learning about burnout and the recovery process. But you don't have to use it sequentially. You can just, use the bits that are relevant to you at this particular point in time. So there's a lot of information here about what burnout is, and a lot of this I've already shared with you today, but it just goes into a little bit more detail. The majority of the modules are videos, so this is an unflattering screenshot of me, but yeah, it's largely delivered, sorry, with video, but then there are some bits where there is just text. So that's the first one, which is all about burnout and what it is. The next phase is getting healthy, so an overview of the recovery process. Module 4 is really helpful for those of you that aren't burnt out but are feeling very stressed and possibly identify with being in stages 1 to 3 of burnout. So I talk a lot about the things that cause burnout in the workplace, and as a medic, you probably tick all of these things, unfortunately, particularly this one, workload. As we know in the NHS, the workload is just insane, right? But there are also some things that will be of interest to you about your individual risk factors for burnout. So the thing about burnout is, and I'm sure you've noticed this, is you can take a group of medics, put them in the same job, in the same hospital, in the same surgery. And some people seem to handle their stress really well and others don't. And some people will burn out and some people won't. And that's because some people are primed for it based on their experiences and sometimes their demographics, the majority of which you can't control, but you can control how you manage those risk factors. So imposter syndrome is a risk factor for burnout, perfectionism, childhood adverse events, trauma, neurodiversity. All of those things will put you at risk. So this is going to be really helpful for those of you that are at risk. And if you are already burnt out, then mitigating those risk factors will form a really key part of your recovery process as well. And then basically loads of exercises that will take you through every single stage of burnout, and you can just use what you need. And then there's a little summary there too. Okay. You've got 6 months to use the course, so feel free to take your time using it. Okay, so I've come to the end of my presentation now. I can see that there is lots of questions. Oh my goodness. So let me just have a quick